All right. So, as I said, what I'd like to do for the second half here is I want to talk about another kind of fun puzzle with regards to numerical identity. Now, note here for this section, we're going to set aside whatever we want to say about indiscernibility and this kind of relationship between identity and indiscernibility. We're going to hold on to the first principle, the identity of indiscernibles. The one that says, right, if two things are identical, then they have all and only the same properties. The kind of one that we bought very early on. And we're going to think about what's the modal strength of numerical identity. If two things are in fact identical, does that mean that they're identical in every possible situation? So kind of invoking some of the modal logic that we talked about before. So what's the relationship between identity and necessity? Does identity hold necessarily, or is it merely contingent? That is, it could hold in one situation and could fail to hold in another. It's notable that contingent identity statements seem intuitively plausible. Right? Easy case, the first man to walk on the moon is Neil Armstrong. But you very easily could imagine a situation where Buzz Aldrin gets a little overexcited, shoves Neil out of the way, and jumps out the hatch first. Buzz could have gotten down first. But note that this statement doesn't involve two names. Right? It involves a name and a definite description. And of course, there's no problem with two definite descriptions picking out different objects or the same object, or similarly, different objects satisfying certain definite descriptions. Easy example, take the teacher of this class, right? Michael taught you for the first half, I've taught you for the second. But a more interesting and challenging question is, like, could we have an identity statement with names on both sides? That's merely contingent. Is there any way that A equals B could be contingent, so possibly true and possibly false, where A and B are both genuine names? So again, do we sort of see the slide here? The first one is a kind of identity, if you like, between a variable and an individual. We're interested in this slightly harder question. So, is there any way we could have an identity statement with names on both sides where it could be contingent? True in some worlds, false in others. Well, Ruth Bark and Marcus and Saul Kripke both have versions of an argument to the effect that, no, identity has to be necessary. If identity holds at all, then it's going to hold in every possible situation. The argument turns on two assumptions. First, we have the indiscernibility of identicals. So this is a kind of FOL version of the principle we saw before. It tells us, hey, for any x and any y, if x is an f, then y is an f. And of course, this could be a bicondition. And the second one is that every object is necessarily self-identical. Now note that this is actually a pretty minimal requirement, because this just says every object stands in this relation, which is fine, right? It's an easy relation. It's cheap and cheery. So with these two principles, we can very quickly get an argument to the effect that an identity statement, if true, is necessary. Now, I'm going to show you the argument. We'll talk through it. I don't expect you to memorize it or anything, but at least just kind of get the gist of it. So here's the argument. We have the initial assumption, right, which is just that, again, principle we had earlier. And the second assumption is our second principle, right? Everything is necessarily self-identical. We then plug in a property, right? And the property we plug in for f is being necessarily self-identical. that is being necessarily identical to x. We slot that in here in place of the f for the antecedent. And of course, we also have to plug it in place for the f in the consequent. And then finally, and this is something very nice because we actually talked about this with our our ML natural production, you can go from this just down to the boxed consequent. So it's a kind of simplification. So what we get then is a very quick argument. For any two objects, if they are in fact identical, then they're necessarily identical. And the trick, the big trick, is plugging in the property of being necessarily identical to x. That's the f that we can slot in. So again, it's not, I don't expect you to necessarily get every single bit about the argument, but to just kind of get a grip on how it goes. Right? And it follows, to go back a slide, it follows from these two principles. This indiscernibility of identicals, right, where we can substitute in properties, and this idea that every object is necessarily self-identical. Not just self-identical, but necessarily so. So there's our quick and dirty argument for identity being modally robust. If actually true, then necessarily so. It's a pretty powerful argument. But, well, I guess one really nice or interesting philosophical upshot of this argument is that it makes a bunch of claims really, really strong. In fact, any theoretical identifications, if this argument's correct, that are true are necessarily true. So here's an easy one. Right? Nathan's pain is identical to a certain state of Nathan's brain. So a kind of physicalist claim about a mental experience. If this is true, given the argument we just saw, this would be necessarily true. Like physicalism isn't just a case, but it's necessarily true, say. Or water's H2O, right? This turns out to not just be true, but it turns out to be necessary.
What is the difference between something being true and something being necessarily true?
Good. What is the difference? Right? Remember, we talked about it. What's the difference between being true and necessarily true? Does anybody remember? What does it mean to be necessarily true? Mm-hmm.
It means that in every world that you can access, that thing is true.
Right. So in some sense, it would mean that in every possible situation, it's true. Contrast that with just being the case in this possible situation. So I ate breakfast this morning, that's true. It's not necessarily true because there's plenty of possible situations where I didn't eat breakfast. That's the kind of idea. Right? Necessarily true means not just the case, but is the case in every possible situation, every accessible situation. And of course, we have questions about which ones are accessible or not. That's the big trick.
And this is for identity statements.
This is for identities, right? So it would mean that not only is some identity actually the case, but if it's actually the case, then it's the case in every possible situation.
For now. Because if I say, I make the identity statement that I am 19 years old.
That's not an identity statement. That's a predication.
Yeah.
Remember, an identity statement has that special form. It uses this, it says we have two objects. And remember also, we're only dealing here with identity statements where we've got names on both sides. So it also doesn't force us to say, to go back one more slide, it doesn't force us to say that, hey, that identity statement's true. But whenever you have an identity statement with names on either side, that's if it's true, it's necessarily true. Bruce Wayne is Batman. Bruce Wayne is necessarily Batman. Nobody else could be him. Because if they were, then it would turn out that they're actually identical to Bruce Wayne, which would be weird. Okay. So again, this kind of argument here is really actually pretty potent. It tells us that theoretical identities, if they're true, must be so. Which is, yeah. Now there's an interesting kind of counter argument, and I want to talk you through it. And it stems from a very fun metaphysical puzzle identified and offered by Alan Gibbard in the 70s. And his argument wasn't originally invoked as a problem for identity, but it's very easy to read it as one. So here's the argument, right? You have a statue and some clay. So we have Goliath. We'll just call the statue Goliath. Goliath is a statue. It has certain shape properties. It plausibly has certain aesthetic properties, whatever. Then we'll have Lumble. Lumble is the lump of clay composing Goliath, right? So Goliath is my beautiful frog, and Lumble is the clay that I've molded to get Goliath. We're just asserting names, right? Giving them names. Now here's something, it's weird, but just spot it. Suppose that Lumble and Goliath, in fact, spatiotemporally coincide. That is, they entirely so. From the moment of their creation to the moment of their destruction, they were always thus. So if you want a kind of easy case, imagine that Lumble was always kind of part of a bigger lump of clay, and that in my perfect artistry, I carved Lumble out in exactly the shape that Goliath was in. So they kind of came into being at the same moment. And I'm going to incinerate them at the same time in a super hot furnace, so they both go out of existence at the exact same moment. So their whole lives, from their creation to their destruction, they're in the same place. In that kind of case, it's very natural to say that they're identical. It's very natural to say they're identical because it feels very strange to say that two distinct physical objects could occupy the exact same places, the exact same time for their entire duration. So there's the first part, right? Lumble and Goliath look like they're, in some sense, identical. So they're actually identical. They don't have to be, though. Here's why. Goliath, being a statue, plausibly has certain properties essentially. That is, if Goliath loses certain properties, then Goliath ceases to be. But these same properties don't seem to be essential to Lumble. So here's an easy one. Goliath, being a statue, has its shape, essentially. If you ruin the shape, you've destroyed Goliath. Because again, Goliath's a work of art. So plausibly, the shape that it has is essential to it. It's somehow really important to it. Goliath doesn't survive being squashed. Lumble does. Lumble's just a lump of fucking clay. It can be any damn shape at once, right? So, here's the thing. We carve our beautiful statue of Geralt, and we're clumsy idiots, and we no longer have a beautiful statue of Geralt, but we still have the same lump of clay. So what does this show us? Plausibly, it's possible for Lumble to survive and Goliath to not. Now, why is that bad? Well, take a world where Goliath ceases to be, but Lumble continues. That looks like a world where they're not identical. Here's an easy way to say why. They have properties where they differ. even in the bluntest sense of one of them is around and the other isn't. One of them was destroyed and the other wasn't. They cannot be identical anymore. So what we have, prima facie case where actual identity is true. Lumpel is in fact Goliath. But the identity is not necessary, because possibly Lumpel is distinct from Goliath. Lumpel survives, Goliath does not. So either, yeah.
But what if you basically say then they're both part as like as Lumpel?
Good. So no, we could totally do it that way, right? So we could make it so that Lumpel isn't actually going to survive after we've done some changes to it. That's totally fine. But note that the kind of worry, and the reason we're focusing on this sort of counterexample, is it seems to raise the challenge for the idea that they're necessarily identical.
But then they are necessary, right? If they claim part, then they are necessary identical, right? Or not?
So remember when we think about necessity, right? It just means, is there any kind of accessible situation where such and such happens? If there is, then the thing isn't going to be necessary. Yeah. It's the first thing. It's just that powerful argument. So again, right, what we're worried about is there any kind of case, any possible situation where they're not identical?
Well, how do you call it when they are identical?
So that's actually true.
Ah.
Yeah. So again, think about it this way, right? We have, like, if we go back to the modal semantics, right, P could be the case in a given world, but also diamond not P could be true in a world because it could see a situation where P is false. So what we're thinking about here is there any accessible situation where the identity claim comes up false? And the kind of one where we like bake it and make Lumpel brittle, that's one where it's going to turn out to be true. We're interested in the other kind of end, right? Yeah.
Isn't there an issue in this only works if you're describing Goliath again, but without a property, right? You're saying it has all the properties it has except for being in this particular shape.
Yeah. Good. So there's a sense in which, right, there's two ways to go in response to this, right? We can either say the identity is contingent, or we can say they were just never identical in the first place. Basically continue on with this necessity of identity claim, and then modus tollens the antecedent. We'll come to that in a second. Yeah.
I have a question about the frog part.
Please.
You were talking about how aesthetically, like the aesthetic property of it. But look at the frog.
Are you trying to say my frog isn't beautiful?
Don't get me wrong. But it's either one piece of clay in the outside is painted, which would make the property of like how it looks different for Goliath than it would for Lumpel, because Lumpel itself is still bland. Or Lumpel has to be 3 different colors.
Yeah, that's okay.
Is that a thing? Like, can that be?
Yeah.
Can different kinds of like clay in this case be part of the same thing?
Absolutely. That would be okay, right? So notably, when we're talking about Lumpel being this sort of lump of clay, it could be like 3 different lumps of clay that I brought together. That would also be another way that they could entirely spatiotemporally coincide. So we had, I guess it'd be, 5? Let's say 1 big green lump, 2 white lumps, and 2 black lumps. And then I just kind of jam them together in the right shape. So then Lumpel is those lumps put together. Goliath is the statue that's composed thereof. That'd be another case. Good. So again, in light of this argument, what can we do? There's basically 2 options. One option is we can go what we'll call one-thingism. One-thingism is that, hey, there is in fact only one thing here. Lumpel is Goliath. It is an identity claim after all. But this identification is only contingent. This fits with the natural idea that you can never have more than one physical object in the exact same place at the exact same time. But they have to then say something against the kind of Barkin-Marcus and Kripke argument for necessity of identity. So that'd be one argument, right? The second argument is we go two-thingism. Two-thingism says, okay, in the actual world, in the frog case, right, we actually just had two things the whole time. There was Lumpel and there was Goliath, and the initial pitch that they were identical is a mistake. The identity claim is false, and it always was false, because identity is necessary. And this is a view that kind of accepts the plausibility of the case and then reverse engineers the actual identity claim. But it has a pretty significant cost in that it has to allow for distinct concrete entities to be able to occupy the same place at the same time, which seems very, very, very weird. So it's a kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you buy the necessity of identity, then you've got to buy something like two-thingism. If you accept the contingency of identity, then you can say, okay, right, we had two things and then they became, we had one thing and then one of the kind of things kind of dropped away, but we still have the lump. It's very hard to even articulate the view in some ways, but it fits really nicely with this idea that we always only have one object in one time. Go back again. We started off, I asked about the puzzle about composition and identity, right? How many things are in my hand? If you buy the idea that there was one thing in my hand, the mug, you already were sliding towards this kind of view. So again, it's kind of fun, and it's an interesting challenge here, because what it suggests is that what we want to say, even just simply about the kind of modal strength of an identity claim, can radically impact the sort of metaphysical views we can adopt. And if you go with two-thingism, there's a further kind of challenge lurking, which is something particularly difficult. Again, it's such a terrible challenge. So, the kind of deep, dark challenge here is not just explaining the distinctness, but it's in fact explaining what causes the distinctness. That is, like, explaining how it is that they have a difference in their persistence conditions. So to go back a second, right, the challenge, if you're a two-thingist, is to say, hey, why is it that under the Goliath description, this thing doesn't survive squashing, but under the Lumpel description, this thing does? How do you kind of explain this difference and what's possible for it? Okay, cool. So again, what I really wanted to try and do was to talk through these two kind of puzzles, if you like, about identity. Our first one, this question about what's the relationship between numerical identity and indiscernibility. And we saw one principle where if two things are identical, then they're indiscernible, which again, kind of classical view of identity. Then there was the slightly more difficult or problematic one of if two things are indiscernible, then they must be identical. And this was the one where we talked about black spheres and the kind of mirror universe and radial symmetry and things. That seems to be slightly less immediately plausible. And then finally, we talked about this sort of, what's the modal strength of identity? And we have on one hand this argument from Barkin-Marcus and Kripke, and on the other hand, this sort of weird case from Gibbard with seemingly identities that turn out to just be merely contingent. And the neat thing is we can kind of carve this how we like. And obviously what I'm going to be interested in terms of pragmatics, something kind of like one of the questions we'll have on the assignment, right? hey, explain to me what the identity of indiscernibles is and why Black's kind of two spheres might be a challenge for it. Explain to me the idea of identity being contingent and why Gibbard's kind of Lumpel-Goliath case might be an argument for it, something like this. Nothing too substantive. It's going to be like a paragraph at most, right? I don't need a whole fucking essay. Cool? Any questions before we wrap up? You feeling okay? So, with regards to kind of going forward, a couple things. So, as I said at the top, before I think we started recording, what I'd like to try and do is definitely have a review day, a review lecture. Review day, Jesus. A review meeting. My aim is to have it on the 12th of December, because again, I understood that to be a day when you don't have any other exams, and it seems pretty well placed. What we'll do, I'm going to upload a practice final exam. I'll do that probably this afternoon or this evening. Yeah, I'll try. And we'll talk through that. I'll also try and reserve some time on Thursday evening or Thursday afternoon to talk through some of it in case people can't make the 12th, right? We'll sort of see how it goes. But we'll also, on Thursday, talk through the questions on this identity assignment. Cool? Wonderful. Well, thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely, lovely, lovely rest of the week. And I will see you hopefully Thursday afternoon. Cool.